Hello, and welcome. I'm honored that you're here today. If you remember when sugar and butter were rationed, when every family had a blue star hanging in their window, when the whole neighborhood gathered around the radio to hear the president speak, then this video is for you. Today, we're going back to the 1940s, perhaps the most consequential decade of the 20th century. For those of you who lived through it, whether you were a child, a teenager, a young adult, or someone already raising a family, the 1940s tested you, changed you, and shaped the rest of your life. This was a decade unlike any other. It began with the world at war and America still feeling the effects of the Great Depression. It ended with victory, with hope, with a baby boom, and with America transformed into a superpower. But in between, in those 10 years, there was sacrifice, worry, loss, courage, and an incredible demonstration of what people can endure and accomplish when they must. For the next hour, we're going to explore what daily life was really like during the 1940s. Not just the big historical events you've seen documented, but the daily reality. The ration books, the victory gardens, the letters from overseas, the work in the factories, the celebrations when the war ended, and the world that emerged in the years that followed. We'll talk about the hard parts and the good parts. We'll remember the worry and the hope. We'll honor the sacrifice while celebrating the resilience. I know that for many of you, these memories are deeply personal. You may have lost someone you loved. You may have served yourself. You may have waited at home, working and praying. Your stories matter immensely, and I hope you'll feel comfortable sharing them in the comments below. So let's travel back together to the 1940s, to a time that tested a generation and revealed what they were made of. The 1940s began with America trying to stay out of the war that was already consuming Europe and Asia. In 1940 and 1941, life went on much as it had in the late 1930s. The Depression was easing, but times were still hard. People were working, raising families, hoping for better days ahead. But the war was always there in the background, in the news, in conversations, in growing concern about what might happen. And then came Sunday, December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. If you were alive that day, you remember exactly where you were when you heard. The news came over the radio. People called each other on the telephone. The word spread through neighborhoods, through churches, through every community in America. The Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor. Over 2,400 Americans were dead. The United States was going to war. The next day, President Roosevelt addressed Congress. His words were broadcast on every radio station. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. Everything changed that day. Everything. Young men rushed to enlist. Recruitment offices were flooded. If you were a young man in 1941, you knew your life was about to change completely. You might be excited, scared, determined, or all of those things at once. But you knew you were going. Even if you didn't enlist immediately, the draft was coming. Millions of young men, 16 million Americans would eventually serve during World War II, left home for training camps, for bases, for ships heading overseas. Do you remember those train station farewells? Mothers crying, girlfriends and wives holding on tight, fathers shaking hands and trying to be strong. Young men in their new uniforms, trying to look confident, leaning out train windows as the train pulled away. You didn't know when or if you'd see them again. While the men went to war, everyone else went to work. The home front became a production front. Factories that had made cars started making tanks and airplanes. Factories that had made washing machines started making ammunition. And women, millions of women went to work in those factories. Rosie the Riveter became the symbol, but there were millions of real women doing the work. If you were a woman in the 1940s, you might have found yourself welding, riveting, operating heavy machinery, doing work that you'd never imagined doing before. You wore pants or coveralls, not dresses. You tied your hair back in a bandana. You worked long shifts, sometimes in dangerous conditions. And you did it because your country needed you, because your husband or brother or son was overseas, because someone had to build the planes and tanks and ships that would win the war. It was exhausting. It was difficult. But many women also found it empowering. You were capable of more than you'd been told, more than society had allowed you to be. And there was more work at home. Victory gardens became essential. If you had any yard space at all, or even just a small plot, you planted vegetables. Do you remember your family's victory garden? Tomatoes, beans, carrots, lettuce, whatever would grow in your area. You planted, weeded, watered, harvested. The food you grew meant more food available for the soldiers. It meant you were contributing. Even city dwellers found places to plant, in window boxes, on rooftops, in community plots. 20 million victory gardens were planted during the war. 20 million families growing their own food. But even with victory gardens, there wasn't enough of everything. Rationing became a way of life. Sugar, meat, butter, coffee, cheese, canned goods, shoes, gasoline, tires, all rationed. You received ration books with stamps, and those stamps were as valuable as money. More valuable sometimes, because even if you had money, you couldn't buy these things without the stamps. You learned to make do with less. You learned to be creative. Mock apple pie made with crackers when you couldn't get apples. Meatless days became common. You saved bacon grease. It was needed for making explosives. You saved every bit of sugar to make special occasions sweet. If you were managing a household during the war, you became an expert at stretching meals, substituting ingredients, making things last. You darned socks instead of buying new ones. You patched clothes over and over. You saved everything that could be reused. It wasn't just thrift, it was patriotism. Using less meant more for the war effort. And there were the blackout drills. Especially if you lived on the coasts, you had blackout curtains, thick, dark fabric that covered every window. When the air raid siren sounded for a drill, you pulled those curtains closed, turned off all lights, and waited. Air raid wardens patrolled neighborhoods, watching for any light showing. Even a small light could, theoretically, help enemy planes target cities. Whether the threat was real or not, you took it seriously. Children contributed too. Scrap drives collected metal, rubber, paper, anything that could be recycled for the war effort. Do you remember hauling old pots and pans, tin cans, rubber tires to collection centers? Schools organized competitions to see which class could collect the most scrap. Children went door to door asking neighbors for anything they could spare. It made you feel like you were helping, like you were part of the effort. And there were war bonds. The government needed money to pay for the war, so they sold bonds. You gave the government money now, and they'd pay you back with interest later. Posters everywhere encouraged you to buy bonds. Movie stars appeared at rallies selling bonds. Even children bought saving stamps at school, 25 cents at a time, working toward a bond. Almost every family had someone serving. Blue stars in the window meant you had a son, husband, brother, father in the service. Families displayed these flags proudly. Gold stars. Gold stars meant your loved one wasn't coming home. When you saw a gold star flag in a neighbor's window, your heart broke for them, and you feared for your own loved ones even more. Letters from overseas were lifelines.
V-mail, Victory Mail, was photographed, reduced, sent on microfilm, then printed again on the other end to save shipping space. The letters were short, sometimes censored, with parts blacked out for security. But they were everything. You read them over and over. You shared news from them with neighbors whose sons were in the same unit. You wrote back constantly, filling your letters with news from home, trying to keep spirits up, telling them they were loved and missed. And you waited.
Every day you waited for the mail. Every day you hoped for another letter, proof that they were still alive, still okay. If your husband was overseas, you managed everything alone. You handled the finances, made the decisions, fixed what broke, raised the children by yourself. You were strong because you had to be. In the evenings, families gathered around the radio for news. Edward R. Murrow broadcasting from London during the Blitz. News from the Pacific, from Europe, from North Africa. You listened for any information about where your loved ones might be, what was happening in the war. At the movie theater, before the feature film, there were newsreels, short films showing war footage, news from the fronts, patriotic messages. You watched them intently, scanning the footage of soldiers, hoping maybe, just maybe, you might catch a glimpse of your loved one. And there was the thing everyone feared most, the Western Union telegram. A messenger boy on a bicycle coming down your street with a telegram. Mothers would see him coming and their hearts would stop. Which house was he going to? Not yours, please God, not yours. The telegrams were brief. The Secretary of War desires me to express his deep regret. If that messenger stopped at your house, your world ended in that moment. But life couldn't be all worry and work. People needed entertainment, needed distraction, needed something to lift their spirits. Radio was everything during the 1940s. Radio brought you news, but it also brought you comedy, drama, music, and escape. Jack Benny making you laugh. Fibber McGee and Molly. The Shadow. Who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men? The Lone Ranger. These shows brought families together, gave you something to look forward to, made you forget your worries for half an hour. And the music, oh, the music of the 1940s. The big band era was at its peak. Glenn Miller, Benny Goodman, Tommy Dorsey, Duke Ellington, Count Basie. The music was sophisticated, romantic, and made you want to dance. Songs about separation and longing, about keeping the home fires burning, about dreams of reunion. The music spoke to what everyone was feeling. The USO, United Service Organizations, brought entertainment to the troops. Bob Hope traveled the world doing comedy shows for soldiers. Movie stars and musicians volunteered their time, performing in hospitals, on bases, anywhere troops were stationed. If you went to these shows as a serviceman, it reminded you of home, lifted your morale, made you feel valued and appreciated. Hollywood did its part too. Movies became more patriotic, more focused on the war effort. Casablanca, Mrs. Miniver, Since You Went Away, films that reflected what people were living through. Movie stars sold war bonds. Some enlisted themselves. Jimmy Stewart became a bomber pilot. Clark Gable served in the Army Air Forces. Going to the movies was affordable entertainment and a way to escape for a couple of hours into a world where good triumphed over evil, where love prevailed, where happy endings were possible. And then, finally, after years of sacrifice and worry and loss, the war began to end. May 8, 1945, VE Day. Victory in Europe. Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. The celebrations were tremendous, but restrained. After all, the war in the Pacific was still raging, and your loved ones might still be there. And then in August, something unprecedented happened. The atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, then Nagasaki. The power was unimaginable, terrifying. The world had changed forever. August 15, 1945, VJ Day. Japan surrendered. The war was over. Really, truly over. The celebrations that day, do you remember? People poured into the streets. Strangers hugged and kissed. Church bells rang. Car horns honked. People cried with relief and joy. The war was over. Your loved ones would be coming home. At least, those who had survived would be coming home. 4 years of war. 16 million Americans served. Over 400,000 never came home. Countless others came home changed, wounded in body or spirit. The relief was overwhelming, but so was the grief for those who were lost. The boys came home. Troop ships arrived carrying thousands of servicemen. Train stations were packed with families waiting, watching every face coming off the train, searching for the one they loved. The reunions, mothers holding sons they hadn't seen in years, wives meeting husbands they barely knew, children meeting fathers they'd never seen or couldn't remember. These reunions were joyful, but also complicated. People had changed.
Years apart, years of different experiences, years of growing up or growing older separately. The GI Bill, officially the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, changed millions of lives. It provided returning veterans with benefits for education, home loans, unemployment assistance. College had been something only wealthy families could afford for their children. But the GI Bill made it possible for veterans to go to college, to get training, to build better futures. Do you remember going to college on the GI Bill? Classrooms full of older students, serious students who'd been through war and were determined to make something of this chance. Universities had to expand rapidly to accommodate all these new students. But adjusting to civilian life wasn't easy. You'd been through things you couldn't talk about. You'd seen things you couldn't forget. The structure of military life, the camaraderie of your unit, the intensity of purpose, none of that existed in civilian life. You had to find work, establish routines, figure out who you were now that you weren't a soldier anymore. Some veterans adjusted quickly, others struggled. There were weddings everywhere. Engagements that had waited through the war were finally happening. Couples who barely knew each other were getting married. You'd met during the war, exchanged letters, and now you were starting a life together. And babies, so many babies. The baby boom was beginning. After years of putting off having children, after years of separation, couples were starting families. Maternity wards were overflowing. If you were a young couple in the late 1940s, you were probably eager to settle down, buy a house, have children, create the normal family life that the war had delayed. But there was a problem: housing. There simply weren't enough homes. Construction had been halted during the war. Now you had millions of veterans returning, getting married, needing places to live, and there was nowhere for them to go. Young families lived with parents, multiple generations crammed into houses meant for one family. Some lived in converted military barracks. Quonset huts, those semicircular metal structures, became temporary homes for some veterans and their families. It was cramped, it was uncomfortable, but you made do because at least the war was over and you were together. And then there were the women who'd worked in the factories. When the men came home, they wanted their jobs back. Industries that had employed women suddenly didn't need them anymore, or didn't want them. Many women went back to being homemakers. That was the expectation. The men had served, now they needed jobs,
and women should return to traditional roles. But it was complicated, wasn't it? If you'd worked in a factory, earned your own money, proven you could do demanding work, it wasn't always easy to go back to just being a housewife. Some women were glad to leave factory work behind. Others missed it, missed the income, missed the independence, missed the purpose. Some women did stay in the workforce as secretaries, teachers, nurses, in traditionally female jobs. But the opportunities that had opened during the war largely closed again. It would be another generation before those doors would start to reopen. But women who'd worked during the war knew what they were capable of. They'd remember. American industry had spent years making weapons and military equipment. Now it had to convert back to making civilian goods, cars, appliances, furniture, clothing. And people were eager to buy. After years of rationing, years of making do, years of sacrifice, people wanted things. New cars, new appliances, new clothes, new furniture. The economy boomed. There were jobs. There was optimism. Yes, there were also strikes and labor disputes as unions pushed for better wages and conditions. Yes, there was inflation and adjustment. But overall, things were improving. In 1946, automobile production resumed. The cars looked much like the 1942 models. Not much had changed in design, but they were new and people wanted them. There were waiting lists for new cars. Automatic washing machines, electric refrigerators, toasters, mixers, products that had been scarce during the war were becoming available again. These appliances promised to make life easier, especially for housewives who were now expected to manage homes without the help they might have had during the war. In the late 1940s, suburbanization was just beginning. Developers started building housing developments for all those veterans and their young families. These weren't the sprawling suburbs of the 1950s yet, but the foundation was being laid. Small houses, affordable prices, designed for young families just starting out. If you bought one of these houses in the late 1940s, it probably seemed like a dream come true. Your own home, a yard for your children, neighbors who were just like you, young families, veterans, people building new lives. The American dream was taking shape, though that term wasn't being used quite yet. But that's what it was. Own your home, raise your family, build a better life than the one you'd known. Homes in the 1940s were smaller and simpler than what we're used to now. If you lived in a typical house during the 1940s, it probably had 2 or maybe 3 bedrooms, 1 bathroom for the entire family, a living room, a kitchen, and perhaps a small dining area. 1 bathroom. Everyone shared it. If you had a large family, you learned to be efficient. You took quick baths, and hot water was limited anyway. Saturday night was often bath night, especially for children. Heating was different too. Many homes still had coal furnaces in the early 1940s. Someone, usually the father or oldest son, had to go down to the basement and shovel coal into the furnace to keep the house warm. The coal man delivered coal, dumping it down a chute into your coal bin in the basement. The work of managing the furnace, banking it at night, stoking it in the morning, was constant during cold months. In the early 1940s, many families still had ice boxes, not electric refrigerators. The iceman delivered blocks of ice, carried them in with huge tongs, placed them in the top compartment of your icebox. You had to use the food in your icebox quickly before it spoiled. You couldn't store as much. Meal planning was more immediate. By the late 1940s, more families were getting electric refrigerators, but they were expensive, a major purchase that you saved for. The style was different from the 1950s. Linoleum on the kitchen and bathroom floors, practical, easy to clean. Wallpaper was common, often with floral or geometric patterns. Furniture was heavier, more substantial, often dark wood. The light, modern look of the 1950s hadn't arrived yet. Things were more traditional, more ornate. If you cooked in the 1940s, you cooked from scratch. There were no convenience foods, no frozen dinners, no instant anything, at least not in the way we think of them now. You baked your own bread or bought it fresh from the bakery. You made your own cakes from basic ingredients, not mixes. You cooked vegetables from your garden or from the market, not from cans or frozen packages. Pressure cookers became popular in the 1940s. They cooked food faster, saved fuel, and were useful during rationing. But they could be dangerous if you didn't use them correctly. Many women were nervous about them at first. Canning and preserving food was essential, especially if you had a victory garden. In late summer and fall, the kitchen became a canning factory. You made jams, jellies, and preserves. You canned tomatoes, beans, pickles, whatever your garden produced. Those jars lined up in your pantry or basement represented security, food for the winter, food you'd grown and preserved yourself. If you had a root cellar or a cool basement, you stored potatoes, onions, carrots, apples, vegetables that would keep through the winter. Wash day was serious work. If you had a wringer washer, and not everyone did, you filled it with hot water heated on the stove, added soap, let the agitator wash the clothes, then fed each piece through the wringer to squeeze out the water.
Then you hung everything outside to dry. In good weather, this was pleasant enough. In winter, you might hang clothes in the basement or even outside where they'd freeze stiff and you'd bring them in to finish drying. Everything had to be ironed. Shirts, dresses, sheets, pillowcases, tablecloths, handkerchiefs, everything. There was no permanent press, no drip-dry fabric. You spent hours each week ironing. Floors had to be swept daily, mopped regularly. Rugs had to be beaten outside to get the dust out. Windows had to be washed. Everything required physical labor. It was exhausting work, especially if you were also working outside the home or managing children or both. Multi-generational households were common. Grandparents often lived with their adult children and grandchildren. This was practical. Older people needed care, younger people needed help with childcare, and housing was expensive and scarce. It meant less privacy, but more help. Grandmother might do the cooking while mother worked. Grandfather might help with repairs. Everyone contributed. Children had real responsibilities. Washing dishes, setting the table, sweeping, taking out ashes from the stove or furnace, helping with laundry, minding younger siblings. These weren't optional. You were part of the family, and the family needed everyone to contribute. Evenings centered around the radio. After dinner, after chores, the family gathered in the living room. Father might read the newspaper. Mother might be mending clothes. Children might be doing homework. But the radio was on, providing entertainment and companionship. You listened to your favorite programs at specific times. If you missed it, you missed it. There was no recording, no watching it later. Bedtime came early, especially in winter. Heating the whole house all night was expensive, so you went to bed, piled on quilts, and stayed warm that way. Sunday remained special. Church in the morning for most families. A big Sunday dinner, often the best meal of the week. Maybe a walk, visiting relatives, or just resting. Stores were closed on Sunday. It was a day of rest, of family, of church. The rhythm of the week was different. If you were a child in the 1940s, your toys were simple. You played with what you had, and you made up the rest with imagination. During the war years, children's play often reflected what was happening. Boys played army with stick guns, dug foxholes in the backyard, reenacted battles. It was how children processed what they heard adults talking about, what they saw in newsreels. Paper dolls that you cut out from magazines or bought in books. You could change their outfits by folding paper tabs. Yo-yos, they'd have contests to see who could do the most tricks. Marbles, cat's eyes, clearies, shooters, jacks, jump ropes. Comic books became hugely popular in the 1940s. Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, Captain America fighting Nazis. Comics cost a dime, and you could trade them with friends.
Adults worried they were bad for children, too violent, too fantastical. But children loved them. Saturday matinees at the movie theater were special. For a quarter or less, you could watch a full movie, a cartoon, a serial adventure that continued week to week. The serials always ended with a cliffhanger, the hero in mortal danger. You'd have to come back next week to see how they escaped. Flash Gordon, the Lone Ranger, Captain Marvel, these serials kept children coming back. Mostly, children played outside. You made up games, explored your neighborhood, climbed trees, built things. You didn't have organized activities or adult supervision. You just played. School in the 1940s was formal and strict. You stood when the teacher entered. You recited the Pledge of Allegiance every morning. You addressed teachers as ma'am or sir. Discipline was swift and certain. If you misbehaved, you might have your knuckles rapped with a ruler, stand in the corner, or receive a paddling. And when your parents found out, you were in trouble again at home. During the war, school had a patriotic focus. You sang patriotic songs. You learned why the war was being fought. You participated in scrap drives and war bond sales. The curriculum was basic but rigorous. Reading, writing, arithmetic. You practiced penmanship every day. Neat, legible cursive writing was essential. You did arithmetic problems in your head or on paper. You memorized multiplication tables, spelling words, poetry. School supplies were precious, especially during the war. Paper was rationed, so you wrote small and used both sides. Pencils were sharpened until they were tiny stubs. Nothing was wasted. Most children walked to school, sometimes quite far. In rural areas, you might walk several miles. In cities, you walked through your neighborhood. School buses existed, but weren't as common as they'd become later. In rural areas, one-room schoolhouses were still common. One teacher taught all grades, 1st through 8th, together in one room. Older students helped younger ones. You learned as much from listening to upper grades lessons as from your own. If you were a child during the war, it shaped your entire childhood. You might not have fully understood what was happening, but you felt the tension, the worry, the changes. Air raid drills at school made war feel real and frightening. You practiced what to do if bombers came, though they never did. You wrote letters to soldiers, maybe your father or brother, maybe someone from your community. Your teacher might have the class write to soldiers overseas to boost morale. You participated in scrap drives, collected newspapers, flattened tin cans, pulled apart rubber bands. You felt like you were helping win the war. And you waited. You waited for your father or brother to come home. You listened when letters arrived. You looked at photographs, trying to remember what they looked like when they'd left. Some children lost fathers, brothers, uncles. You became a gold star family. Other children might have been kind, or they might not have known what to say. Adults try to explain, but how do you explain war and death to a child? You grew up faster than you should have had to. Fashion in the 1940s was shaped by necessity. During the war, fabric was rationed. It was needed for military uniforms, parachutes, other war materials. Women's skirts became shorter to save fabric, mid-calf instead of ankle length. Styles became simpler, with fewer pleats, less decoration. The government even issued regulations about how much fabric could be used in clothing. But women still tried to look nice. You made do. You got creative. Nylon stockings were impossible to get. Nylon was needed for parachutes. So women drew lines up the backs of their legs with eyebrow pencils to create the illusion of stockings. You had to be careful not to smudge them. Some women used leg makeup, a kind of liquid that tinted your legs tan, and then drew the seam line carefully up the back. You mended everything. Darned socks, patched clothes, turned collars and cuffs when they wore out, remade old dresses into new styles. Make do and mend was a government slogan, and everyone lived by it. Flour sacks were printed with pretty patterns because manufacturers knew women would make them into clothes, dish towels, aprons, anything. Clothing was practical and utilitarian during the war. Suits with boxy shoulders, simple lines, separates you could mix and match to create different outfits. Young men, especially in cities, especially among Black and Latino youth, wore zoot suits, high-waisted, wide-legged trousers, long coats with padded shoulders. The suits used a lot of fabric, which was seen as unpatriotic during rationing. There were tensions, even riots in some cities, over zoot suits. The Los Angeles zoot suit riots in 1943 reflected larger racial and cultural tensions. Most men wore suits more conservative than zoot suits, narrower lapels, less fabric. If you were a working man, you wore a suit, a tie, a hat, always a hat. Fedoras, trilbies, Homburgs, every man had a hat. Women's hairstyles are iconic. The victory rolls, the pin curls, the waves. These styles took work. You set your hair with bobby pins and clips, slept on it uncomfortably, and brushed it out in the morning. Do you remember sleeping in pin curls? Those metal clips digging into your scalp all night? But you did it because you wanted to look nice, because style mattered even during hard times. The pinup girl look became popular. Rita Hayworth, Betty Grable. Glamorous, feminine, with those perfect victory rolls and red lips. Movie stars influenced how everyday women wanted to look. Makeup was available but limited during the war. You made it last. You shared with friends. Women found creative substitutions, beet juice for lip color, Vaseline for shine. After the war, when cosmetics became more available again, it felt like a luxury to have a full selection of lipsticks and powders. Men kept their hair neat and short, often with a side part and a bit of pomade to keep it in place. Military influence was strong. Even after the war, men kept their hair relatively short and tidy. During the war, USO dances were major social events. Young women would go to dance with servicemen. It was considered patriotic, a way to boost morale. The big band music played and you danced. The jitterbug, the Lindy Hop, swing dance. Energetic, athletic dancing that required skill and practice. Do you remember learning to dance? The boy leading, the girl following, spinning and swinging to that big band rhythm?
It was a skill you were expected to have, a social necessity. Drive-in movie theaters started appearing in the late 1940s. You'd drive up in your car, park in rows facing a big screen, hang a speaker on your window, and watch the movie from your car. For young couples, it offered privacy. For families with small children, it meant you could bring the kids without worrying about them disturbing other moviegoers. Soda fountains at the local drugstore were social centers. You'd meet friends there after school, on Saturday afternoons. You'd sit at the counter or in a booth, order a soda or a phosphate or a milkshake, and talk for hours. The soda jerk, the person making the drinks, became skilled at creating these concoctions, often with flair and showmanship. Dating in the 1940s was more formal and supervised than it would become later. If you were a young woman, your parents wanted to know who you were going out with, where you were going, and when you'd be home. Dates were often chaperoned, especially early dates. A group might go together to a movie or dance. You didn't spend time alone with a boy until you knew him well and your parents approved. During the war, there were rushed weddings. A soldier had a brief leave before shipping overseas, and couples married quickly, not knowing when or if they'd see each other again. These weddings were often simple. No elaborate dress, no big reception, just a quick ceremony and a few hours together before the train departed. Going steady meant you were seriously dating one person. The boy might give the girl his class ring or his letter jacket to wear. It was a public declaration that you were a couple. Community life was strong in the 1940s. Church socials, potluck dinners, community meetings, these brought people together regularly. Churches weren't just for Sunday worship. They were social centers, places where the community gathered, where relationships were built and maintained. When the war ended, neighborhoods erupted in celebration. Block parties, dancing in the streets, everyone coming together to mark the moment. That sense of shared experience, shared sacrifice, shared victory, it created strong community bonds.
In rural areas, barn dances were popular social events. You'd gather at someone's barn, push back the hay, bring out the fiddles and guitars, and dance. Square dancing, folk dancing, everyone participating. Social clubs and organizations were important. The American Legion for veterans, the Grange for farmers, garden clubs, sewing circles, fraternal organizations. People were joiners. You belonged to groups, contributed to communities. It was less about individual entertainment and more about being part of something larger than yourself. The 1940s was the golden age of radio. If you lived through it, you remember how important the radio was. It was your connection to the world, your source of news and entertainment, the center of family life. Every evening, families gathered around the radio for their favorite programs. The shows aired at specific times, and you planned your evening around them. Sunday nights, you listened to Jack Benny at 7, followed by Edgar Bergen and Charlie McCarthy. Other nights brought Fibber McGee and Molly, The Shadow, The Weed of Crime Bears Bitter Fruit, The Lone Ranger with his Hi-Yo Silver. Radio dramas created entire worlds with just voices and sound effects. Your imagination filled in the pictures. You sat in your living room, but in your mind, you were in the middle of the adventure, the mystery, the romance. President Roosevelt's fireside chats were events. His voice came into your home, speaking directly to you. During the dark days of the Depression and the war, his voice provided reassurance, strength, a sense that someone was in charge and things would be okay. When he died in April 1945, just before the war ended, it was like losing a member of the family. He'd been president for 12 years. Many young people couldn't remember another president. During the day, soap operas kept housewives company while they worked. These serialized dramas, called soap operas because soap companies sponsored them, continued day after day, week after week. You got invested in the characters, their lives, their problems. News came primarily through radio during the war. Edward R. Murrow broadcasting from London during the Blitz, bombs exploding in the background. War correspondents reporting from the front lines. These broadcasts made distant events feel immediate and real. The telephone in the 1940s was a luxury many families still didn't have. If you had one, it was likely a party line. You shared the line with other families. You'd pick up the phone to make a call and might hear neighbors already talking. You were supposed to hang up and wait, but some people listened in. Privacy was limited. Each family had their own ring pattern, maybe 2 short ring and a long ring. You learned to recognize your ring and only answered when it was yours. Long-distance calls required operator assistance and were expensive. You didn't call long distance casually. It was for emergencies, important news, special occasions. When you made a long-distance call, you told the operator what number you wanted, and she connected you. You watched the clock because every minute cost money. Newspapers were the primary source of written news. Most cities had morning and evening editions. The newspaper boy delivered them to your door, or you bought them from a newsstand. You read the paper thoroughly: news, comics, advice columns, advertisements. The newspaper connected you to your community and the world. At the movie theater, newsreels provided filmed news. They were produced by companies like Movietone News and Pathé. You'd see footage of the war, political events, sports, human interest stories. These newsreels shaped how people understood current events. Seeing the war on film, even if it was edited and delayed, made it more real than just hearing about it. But a lot of information spread by word of mouth. Neighbors talking over the fence, at church, at the store. News traveled through communities person to person. This created strong connections, but also meant rumors could spread quickly. During the war, gasoline was rationed. Your windshield had a sticker indicating how much gas you were allowed to buy. A stickers were most common, just a few gallons a week, enough for essential driving. B stickers were for people who needed more gas for their work. C stickers were for doctors, police, essential workers. T stickers were for trucks. People carpooled, walked more, rode bicycles. Is this trip really necessary? Posters asked. You thought twice before using your car. Tires were also rationed. Rubber was needed for the war effort. You couldn't just buy new tires whenever you wanted. You maintained your tires carefully, drove conservatively to make them last. No civilian cars were produced from early 1942 until 1945. Automotive factories made tanks, jeeps, airplane parts instead. If you needed a car during those years, you had to buy used, and used cars became very expensive. Trains were the primary way to travel long distances. Passenger trains were often crowded, especially during the war when servicemen and essential workers were traveling. You might have to stand for hours on a train. Seats were hard to get. But trains connected the country, made travel possible even when gasoline was rationed. After the war, when car production resumed, people lined up to buy new cars. There were waiting lists. Dealerships had more customers than cars. If you got a new car in 1946, you were fortunate. Let's step back and look at the bigger picture of what World War II meant. 16 million Americans served in the armed forces during World War II. That's about 11% of the entire population. Almost every family was directly affected. Over 400,000 Americans died in the war. Over 670,000 were wounded. These weren't just statistics. These were sons, fathers, brothers, husbands. These were real people with families who loved them and mourned them. As the war ended, the world learned the full horror of the Holocaust. 6 million Jews murdered by the Nazis. The concentration camps, the gas chambers, the systematic attempt to destroy an entire people. American soldiers who liberated the camps saw things that haunted them for the rest of their lives. The world had to confront what human beings were capable of doing to one another. Out of the horror came determination that this must never happen again. The United Nations was founded in 1945, an attempt to create international cooperation and prevent future world wars. The atomic bomb changed everything. Suddenly, humanity had the power to destroy itself. The nuclear age brought promise, atomic energy for peaceful purposes, and terror, the possibility of nuclear annihilation. This would shape international relations and American anxiety for decades to come. America emerged from World War II as a superpower.
The war had devastated Europe and Asia, but America's homeland was untouched. American industry was strong. The American military was the most powerful in the world. This would define America's role in the world for the rest of the century and beyond. What America accomplished on the home front during the war was extraordinary. The production numbers are almost unbelievable. American factories produced 300,000 aircraft, 88,000 tanks, 3,000 ships, millions of guns, billions of bullets. The entire economy converted to war production, and it worked. Medical advances came rapidly. Penicillin, which had been discovered in 1928, was mass-produced during the war and saved countless lives. Blood banks were established. Surgical techniques improved. Medical knowledge gained from treating war wounded benefited everyone afterward. Radar, sonar, jet engines, computers. Technologies developed for the war would transform civilian life in the decades that followed. The war accelerated technological progress in ways that would have taken much longer in peacetime. Now we need to talk about something difficult but important. The 1940s were a time of stark racial injustice in America. The American military was segregated during World War II. Black soldiers served in separate units, often in support roles rather than combat, though there were notable exceptions. The Tuskegee Airmen, black pilots who flew combat missions, proved their skill and courage, challenging racist assumptions. But they had to fight for the right to serve in combat roles. Mexican-American soldiers served with distinction, yet at home they faced discrimination. The Zoot Suit riots in Los Angeles in 1943 saw white sailors attacking young Mexican-American men, reflecting racial tensions. And then there was the internment of Japanese Americans. Over 120,000 Japanese Americans, most of them American citizens, were forced from their homes and imprisoned in internment camps for the duration of the war. They lost their homes, their businesses, their possessions. They were imprisoned simply because of their ancestry, without any evidence of wrongdoing. It was a profound injustice, though it wouldn't be officially acknowledged as such for many years. Some young Japanese American men still volunteered to serve in the military from the camps, fighting for a country that had imprisoned their families. Segregation remained legal throughout the South and in many other places. Whites-only signs marked water fountains, restaurants, hotels, swimming pools. Black Americans lived under Jim Crow laws. They couldn't vote in many places. They faced violence and intimidation. They were second-class citizens in the country they'd helped defend. The Double V campaign among Black Americans called for victory abroad against fascism and victory at home against racism. Black newspapers and leaders asked, how can we fight for freedom overseas while being denied freedom at home? The war planted seeds for the civil rights movement that would grow in the 1950s and explode in the 1960s. Black veterans came home having fought for their country and were no longer willing to accept second-class status. The contradiction between American ideals of freedom and the reality of segregation became harder to ignore or justify. Remember, the 1940s began with America still feeling the effects of the Great Depression. Unemployment was still high in 1940. Many families were still struggling. The war brought jobs, brought purpose, brought economic recovery. But it also brought rationing, sacrifice, worry. The government controlled prices to prevent inflation. Ration boards decided who got what. There was a black market for rationed goods, people selling ration stamps, buying goods illegally. Most people followed the rules because it was patriotic, but the temptation was there when you couldn't get what you needed legally. After the war, there were strikes and labor disputes. Workers had accepted wage controls during the war, but now they wanted better pay and conditions. Unions were strong and getting stronger. There was inflation as price controls ended. There were shortages of some goods as industries transitioned from military to civilian production. It wasn't all smooth sailing, but overall, the economy was recovering and growing. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was president from 1933 until his death in April 1945. He led America through the Depression and most of World War II. His leadership was steady, his voice reassuring. When he died, people wept openly in the streets. The train carrying his body back to Hyde Park, New York, was lined with mourners the entire way. Harry Truman became president on April 12, 1945. He'd been vice president for only 82 days. Suddenly, he was president at a crucial moment. The war still going on, enormous decisions to be made. Truman made the decision to use the atomic bomb. He oversaw the end of the war, the beginning of the Cold War, the rebuilding of Europe through the Marshall Plan. "The buck stops here," read a sign on his desk. He took responsibility, made tough decisions, and didn't flinch from them. Even as World War II ended, a new conflict was beginning.
The Soviet Union, America's ally during the war, was becoming an adversary. Winston Churchill spoke of an iron curtain descending across Europe. Eastern Europe was falling under Soviet control. The Cold War was beginning. Concern about communism was growing. There were fears of communist infiltration, communist spies, communist influence. This would grow into the paranoia of the McCarthy era in the early 1950s. And there was the atomic bomb. America had it, but how long before the Soviets had it too? They tested their first bomb in 1949. The possibility of nuclear war created a new kind of anxiety. The world had changed. The old certainties were gone. America was powerful, but also vulnerable in new ways. And so we come to the end of our journey through the 1940s. What an extraordinary decade it was. Perhaps no other decade in the 20th century asked so much of ordinary people. You were asked to send your sons, husbands, fathers, brothers to war. You were asked to work long hours in difficult conditions. You were asked to do without, to ration, to sacrifice, to make do with less. You were asked to live with fear and uncertainty, not knowing if your loved ones would come home. And you did it. You did all of it. You celebrated when victory came, but the celebration was tinged with grief for those who didn't come home and with exhaustion from the years of strain. And then you built. You went to college on the GI Bill. You found jobs. You got married. You started families. You bought homes. You created the prosperous America of the 1950s out of the ashes of the 1940s. We should acknowledge that not everyone's 1940 was the same. For some Americans, the decade brought opportunity and progress. For others, it brought continued discrimination and injustice along the shared sacrifice. The 1940s were complicated. There was heroism and prejudice, sacrifice and selfishness, unity and division. There was the best of humanity and some of the worst. But for those of you who lived through it, whether you were a child trying to understand why your father was gone, a teenager working in a factory, a young adult serving overseas or waiting at home, or someone older trying to hold everything together, you were part of something historic. Your generation has been called the greatest generation. And while no generation is perfect, there's truth in that label. You faced extraordinary challenges and rose to meet them. The 1940s took you from the darkness of war to the hope of peace, from rationing and sacrifice to the beginning of prosperity, from uncertainty to confidence in the future. The decade shaped everything that came after. The Cold War, the Civil Rights Movement, the prosperity of the 1950s, the social changes of the 1960s, all of it had roots in the 1940s. Your memories of this decade are precious. Whether you remember the worry of waiting for letters, the relief of VJ Day, the taste of real butter when rationing ended, your first new dress after the war, coming home from overseas, or starting your family in those post-war years, these memories are part of our collective history. Thank you so much for taking this journey back to the 1940s with me. I know these memories may bring up complex emotions, pride, grief, nostalgia, perhaps difficult recollections alongside cherished ones. I would be honored if you'd share your memories in the comments. What do you remember most about the 1940s? Did you serve in the war?
Did you work on the home front? How did your family cope with rationing? What was VJ Day like where you were? Your stories matter. They're living history, and sharing them helps younger generations understand what you lived through. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. We have a companion video about life in the 1950s, and we'll be continuing this series exploring life in the 1960s and 1970s as well. Until next time, thank you for watching. Please let us know in the comments what your favorites memories are of the 1940s.